Hello. A few people have indicated that they would be interested in knowing a little bit more about me and my life and my history. So be careful what you wish for. I thought that the idea wasn't entirely without appeal, and I thought I might have a little bash at it. It will be interesting to see what I can remember, because a lot of my early childhood I have repressed unknowingly and never really gone into it that or investigated it in any way. I've just accepted that that's the way it is. And the other reason that my memory might not be pin sharp is that later in my adult life I had the misfortune to be taken drunk surprisingly often. So this could be interesting. I should warn you that some sensitive topics are likely to come up, so some level of viewer discretion is advised, and apologies if anything that I discuss is upsetting to anybody in any way. Okay, let's do this. Welcome to A Potted History of Boaty.
YouTube channel's not any good, but he's a nice guy. I'm sorry, Mr. Boaty.
Sorry about that. Well, to begin at the beginning, and I guess if we're going to talk about me, then we need to talk about the people that made me, the people who brought me about, the reason why I came to be. And that, of course, is my parents. And they were interesting people. Both of them are no longer with us. And at some point in the future, in about episode 7643 of this, the circumstances of their passing will probably come into play. But yeah, interesting people, both admirable and flawed in their way. But let's tell the story. And let's start with my father. Now, I consider myself to be 100% Welsh, but as you will discover, I'm actually not. However, my heritage on my father's side is entirely Welsh, and the best sort of Welsh, South Walians. My grandfather, let's start with him. My grandfather was quite a heroic figure. He was a product of the Indian Raj, in that his family were British colonials, and they were out in India, and that's where my grandfather was brought up. He remained fluent in Hindi until the day that he died at the grand old age of 93. And he went on in his turn to become a career soldier, a career army man. He was a regimental sergeant major in the Paras, and he was an extraordinarily strong, both physically strong. He was an athlete, which kind of runs in the family from both sides, my mother and my father. And he competed in the Olympics, in the 4x400 relay, I think, and he was also a very talented gymnast. But he was also an incredibly strong-minded man, the strongest-minded man that I've ever ever known. I mean, he was just, and everybody who knew him at any point in his life would tell you exactly the same thing. Harry Hughes, his name was. Henry Parry Hughes, to give him his proper name, but known as Harry. Although it's a weird thing that in his later life, his closest friend, who'd known him for 40 odd years, John Crates, his best friend in the world, always called him Mr. Hughes. He was that sort of man. No matter how friendly you might be with him, he was always Mr. Hughes. And obviously, prior to that, in the army, he would have been, I don't know, how do you address an RSM? Sarge, I imagine? But an incredibly tough man. There was not a single element of weakness anywhere about his character. Staunch chapel man, admirable in every sense. I grew up admiring him intensely and also recognising that I could never be like him, but rather wishing that I could. He served in the Second World War and served with distinction. He was highly honoured and he's featured in many books and various videos, films and television programmes. He never spoke about his war experiences until he was in his 90s. And with bloody good reason. But he was highly decorated, highly respected, and many people owe their lives to him, although of course, like him, they would all be long gone now, I'm sure. He was one of the last. But when he settled into civilian life in South Wales with my grandmother, he became a civil engineer, and he was in charge of most of the open cast mining in the valleys of South Wales. And he was also, his passion was horses, and he was a true horseman, a horse whisperer, if you like. The bond and connection that he had with horses was beyond belief, really. Horses that were entirely unmanageable in any other hands. I remember an enormous stallion we had called Tywasog, that's Prince in Welsh. And nobody could handle him, but in my grandfather's hands, he was like a Labrador puppy. Now, my grandmother was a good South Walian girl, but a bit of get up and go about her, and a bit of a go-getter. And she went to London and started a business which was successful. And she met my grandfather, and when the army was all done and dusted and so on and so on and so on, they settled back into South Wales, and at some point had my father, who was an only child. With what I know now, I suspect that my grandmother, bless her, was probably somewhat dysfunctional, and there certainly in terms of being a parent. And there are some stories knocking about. I don't really know all of the ins and outs. My mother came out with some bits that apparently she wanted a girl, and it was a bit of a disappointment to have a boy, and she didn't entirely hide that. And I can imagine that things would not have been entirely easy for my father with a mother who was perhaps dysfunctional in some way, and with a father who was a hell of a lot to live up to. I kind of had that with my dad, but then I kind of didn't. which will become apparent. So my father was born in Aberdare, and when he was quite young, my grandparents moved with him to the bungalow in Glynneath, which is where they ended their days. Now, my father was something of a dichotomy, as it turned out. He was he was kind of a prodigy in many ways. He was probably one of those kids that you hated when you were at school, because he was big, and he was a talented sportsman. Whatever he turned his hand to, he was naturally good at. He was a sensational rugby player, although he had a reputation as one of the dirtiest players ever to tread on a pitch, which he always strenuously denied. But even when he was at school, he had a record of hospitalising people that came up against him on the pitch. He was also a talented weightlifter, heavyweight boxer, and bizarrely, javelin thrower. And he also dabbled with discus and other things, but his main sport was my own sport, cycling. That became his passion, and as with the other sports, although he dedicated himself to cycling much more than any other sport, I think, again in retrospect, I suspect that it was an escape for him. And that's how many great cyclists begin. They're trying to escape from something. There has to be a reason to go out and do 7, 8, 9 hour rides of 150 miles entirely alone in all weathers. There's normally something that you're trying to escape from, and in hindsight, I'm sure that was the case with my father. Aside from his physicality, he was also immensely gifted intellectually, and I do mean immensely. The term genius is bandied about. He genuinely was a genius in terms of his IQ. This is going to sound somewhat immodest, but he's the only person that I've ever encountered who has a properly, officially recorded IQ higher than mine. And I've done, again, we'll get onto this, I've done 1 million IQ tests. And he did too, and for fun we used to do some together, and he was just cleverer than me. That's the top and the bottom of it. And his story was one of success, really. He was the first boy from the village to gain a scholarship to the posh grammar school, which was Neath Grammar. He was the first boy from Neath Grammar to go to the LSE, the London School of Economics, and he graduated with first class honours, which again was certainly a first in the local area, possibly in South Wales, I don't know. But what is for sure is that he had an emotional fragility. No doubt in those days it would never have been recognised at the time, but it did become apparent. He had this amazing academic career, and that was run in tandem with an amazing sporting career. He was cycling full time, a very competitive racing cyclist. He set records that are held, to my knowledge, to this day. And had he chosen to, who knows where he could have gone with that. As it turns out, having graduated, he went a more corporate route and initially joined the civil service. And he found that, a bit like me, he had a flair, a very definite flair, and the civil service didn't encourage flair. They encouraged steady, and he fairly quickly moved into retail, and he worked for Littlewoods, which I'm not up on shops, I don't know if they're still about, but at the time it was one of the major chain stores. And he climbed the management ladder with Littlewoods really very, very quickly indeed. He went from assistant manager to store manager to regional manager, and then he became some form of Uber regional manager, where he was overseeing stores around the UK and around the United Kingdom. He was having a pretty fantastic life, to be fair. And then something happened, and I never got to the absolute nub of it, but he was engineered or cherry-picked for a position of some form of director, and this was all put into place. And then something happened when he was opening some new stores in Northern Ireland. Something happened, and he didn't get the gig. I've no idea what. It was all a bit hazy when he talked about it, and maybe I wasn't listening properly. But it didn't happen, and that sparked something. Whether it was he always had a massive inferiority complex, which seems daft given his prowess in so many ways. And yet, inferiority complexes, they're not logical. That's kind of the point of them. And again, if you look into his history, it was all escape. Sport is an escape. And intellectualism, and certainly in an academic sense, is also an escape, because you can get away from real life, which will involve things that you can't control possibly, and immerse yourself into areas where you can absolutely control. If you're on a rugby pitch, you're in control of what happens to you. It's a purely physical thing. If you're in a boxing ring, again, you're in control. If you're lifting weights, if you're on a bicycle, which was my own form of escape, you're in control. And the same is true academically. You don't, if you are able to excel academically, then whilst you're doing so, you don't need to question yourself. You have a reason for being. You have the approbation from your peer group. You have the feeling that you are worthwhile. I recognise all of this only too well. As you'll discover as we go on with this, a lot of my life was learning from my father's mistakes, which is harsh. They weren't mistakes, they were just the cards that he was dealt. Whether that was down to just who he was, or whether it was societal influences from his childhood, parental input, we will never know. But I recognise so many similarities that a lot of my life has been spent putting things into place to make sure that I didn't go down the same road. And let's talk about what that road was. So I mentioned that this thing happened, and that was enough to trip him into, again, it wasn't recognised at the time, but pretty much a mental breakdown, a nervous breakdown, I think we would call it these days. And he kind of dropped out. That one little setback, which was entirely out of his control and entirely undeserved, was enough to trigger a thing in his mind that he wasn't worthy of or capable of continuing down that route. And he dropped out. And he ended up in Birmingham, and this is where things get a little bit dodgy. Excuse me, let's have a swig of wine. So he ended up, again going back to the sporting thing, he went back to riding the bike, but he went back to physicality. Now, my father was a big man, not as tall as me. He was 6 foot, but he was 6 times wider than me. And he was incredibly strong and very proficient in terms of, and there's no other way of putting this, he was incredibly good at being violent. And that was his escape, and that was his safety net. So that's what he fell into. He started working doors in Birmingham, and he ended up working with one of the Birmingham gangs, one of the Irish gangs. There was, and I'm sure remains, a lot of gang stuff that goes on in Birmingham. Gang warfare, really. Let's be honest about it. And these gangs would own pubs and clubs and casinos, and there would be rivalry between them, and people would be deployed almost like pieces in a chess match to do not very nice things. And my father was one of these people, and arguably one of the best. I'm not going to go into details about all of this. There are books that have been written about the times, and websites and television programs, and if you cared to go into those, it would be pretty obvious which of the names my father was, but I'm not gonna go there. But my father was, for quite a time, one of, if not the most feared men in Birmingham. And it was during that time that he met my mother. So let's talk about my mum. I'm just going to go for a cigarette. Back in a minute.